I'm Doug Schmidt. I look forward to talking with you folks today, together with my colleague Abhishek Dubey, about blockchain and why it matters to us, where us is sort of the middleware IoT community. So unless you've been frozen in carbonide, like Han Solo, you're probably familiar with blockchain, or at least you've heard of blockchain. And so we'll talk a little bit about what it is and what that means. Here's what I'll be talking about today with my colleague. First, we'll talk briefly about why IoT systems need some new mechanisms for decentralized control and decentralized information. And then I'll give a little overview of what blockchain is and why it matters to us. Then Abhishek will talk deeper about the technology foundations of blockchain, and then he'll explore how blockchain provides some challenges and opportunities in the context of IoT and beyond. There's other things beyond the IoT systems that are important here, but we'll focus primarily on that. So let's first start by giving a little motivation, decentralized control information in IoT systems. So if you take a look around at some of the interesting systems that are evolving, some of which are still in the prototyping phase, some of which are a little past that point, things like transportation and autonomous vehicles, microgrids for power distribution in sustainable energy contexts, healthcare, of course, smart buildings, smart cities. You see a lot of these application domains requiring decentralized control and decentralized information in the IoT space. For example, something I have been doing for a long time is working on real-time dissemination of information and also time-synchronized execution of tasks in these environments, which are sometimes wired, sometimes wireless, sometimes battery-powered, sometimes plugged into a wall socket. And then, of course, the other thing that's important is to be able to ensure information integrity across all the actors in the system. And these actors are often dynamic, they come and go, and we want to be able to find some way of developing these systems effectively, where effectively means can meet quality of service requirements, are relatively straightforward to develop and debug, and of course, these days are secure and privacy preserving, because that's the world we live in, all kinds of bad actors out there trying to cause trouble. All right, so that's kind of the high level context and motivation. Well, if you look at my work over the past 30 years, one thing that's always fascinated me is figuring out how to take technologies that were designed for sort of commercial off-the-shelf purposes, like, say, Corba or Java back in the day, and then determining what patterns and what mechanisms and capabilities need to be added in order to make these things work in a more time-critical or mission-critical environment. So sort of Internet of Things or cyber-physical systems. So one of the things that's happening now that kind of provides the context for this is digital asset management. You probably all know what a digital asset is. It's basically something that exists in binary form that comes with some rights for use. Some digital assets are what we would consider native digital assets. These are assets that have no physical representation and it can be owned or controlled to provide value. So all the stuff that we carry around in our smartphones, right? So music, videos, electronic funds, software itself, right? These are all classic native assets. There's also digital representations of more traditional assets. These are things that were historically represented by paper certificates or titles. So things like stock certificates or property, gold, automobiles, currency, things you used to carry around in your wallet, like euros or dollars or something like that. And I think it's pretty clear now, this day and age, that many aspects of our global economy depend very heavily on the management and exchange of digital assets. So obviously entertainment, digital rights management, finance, transmitting information, settling accounts, energy, you'll hear more about the interesting energy applications a little bit later from Abhishek, defense, trying to make sure that people don't walk away with trade secrets and other classified or controlled information. Elections, people seem to do elections on the web. That's obviously a big issue, trying to avoid fraud. Other things like reputation and social networks. You don't want to have people fabricate your identity and then post all kinds of inflammatory things to make you look bad and so on and so forth. In this context, there's a number of common operations on digital assets that are worth thinking about. Probably the most classic of these, of course, are online secure transactions, recording and transferring digital assets between senders and receivers. So this is what a banking system historically does. And in that case, the people who manage the electronic accounts are tracking ownership and balance. So that's one set of things you might want to do with a digital asset. Something that's actually a little bit more interesting in some sense and goes beyond just sort of the financial services realm is keeping track of identity attestation, saying, who is someone, and chain of custody, provenance tracking, trying to allow an identity or an entity to make claims that can be verified later. So a good example, people are working on ways of being able to keep track of identity for the billion or so people in the world who lack some state-provided identity. So refugees would be one good example. There's also lots of places where they don't have effective governments. So how do you know if a particular person is a refugee and where they go and what kind of rights do they have and what kind of access to aid do they get? And so there are various ways of using biometrics coupled with identity management in order to be able to figure out whether someone is moving around, the same person showing up in 5 refugee camps 20 minutes apart, right? So maybe that's an example of fraud. And there's also lots of cases where you want to be able to track the identity of documents and know what's changed and show the chain of custody over time. And in some sense, that's perhaps even more interesting than just the classic transaction stuff. These digital assets have historically been managed by centralized authorities and brokers. And in this context, the broker has served as the trusted intermediary. They're there working between the buyer and the seller. Examples, of course, financial institutions like banks, credit agencies, which are doing a bit more than just managing balances, which is what a bank is doing. They're really managing your identity and your creditworthiness and so on and so forth. Electronic medical records, which are even more than just balances. They're keeping track of information about you, what medications you're taking, what treatments you've had, and so on and so forth. And also something that's very interesting and becoming more important are electric transactions in various smart grid contexts, such as a microgrid, where people are buying and selling energy in a community environment. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. The downside, of course, is these classic ways of doing things with centralized authorities have a number of limitations. For example, they tend to be rather insecure. So you undoubtedly have noticed over the past 5 years or so, there's been a number of well-publicized data breaches. One that affected all of the people in the US, sadly, hundreds of millions of people, was the hack into Experian, the credit reporting agency. For those people out there who have security clearances, somebody hacked into the Office of Personnel Management and stole all the security clearance information. And then, there's WikiLeaks and all kinds of other things where people are getting access to troves of documents and emails and other stuff they wouldn't want to have everybody have. So centralized approaches provide central points of attack. Another problem, of course, with traditional approaches is that they tend to be rather expensive. And that's because there's this middle person in between the buyers and the sellers who's taking a cut of everything that goes along. And I think there's a classic quote by Andy Tannenbaum, the famous OS researcher, about layering. And the problem isn't the layer, one layer maybe isn't too bad, but you start having each layer add overhead and you have layer after layer after layer, pretty soon it starts to add up. Same thing happens a lot with centralized proprietary brokers. And another problem, which is something that I think we don't give enough attention to as technologists, but we probably should, is the vulnerability to abuse by centralized ways of organizing digital assets. And there's a lot of good examples of this. Whenever you start having central brokers for things, be it the money system or information, it concentrates a lot of power and control and wealth in a small number of institutions. And this is both a blessing and a curse. So the good news is when questionable transactions occur, you typically have recourse. You can go to your bank and say, hey, someone stole my credit card, or they stole my identity. Can you put all those fraudulent charges back in my electronic account, please? That's the good part. The bad part is people can come in and change a bunch of transactions that maybe weren't questionable, and you may or may not have much control about that. So there's a lot of interesting issues there about social control and who controls the information. And I think this is something we need to think a lot more about as a global society, because it's becoming a big problem. So blockchain is designed fundamentally to manage digital assets more effectively by disintermediating these brokers. So the idea here is you want to try to get the middle person, the middleman, the middle woman out of the way, and then be able to have people work together more effectively without having all those downsides. Now, the key thing to remember throughout the rest of the talk is that blockchain technologies work most effectively for systems where disintermediation is more important than confidentiality, at least blockchain today. And we'll talk a little bit later about some things we're doing to fix that problem. Because right now, a lot of the metadata is in the clear, and so you can still tell what's going on. And so some systems work well that way, some don't. And this leads to a lot of confusion when people start looking further into this. Well, that then begs the next question, what the heck is a blockchain? Some of you probably know this, but for those of you who don't, I'll give you a little rundown. And it's also interesting because it really segues nicely into the middleware and IoT parts. So at a high level, a blockchain is essentially a decentralized platform that supports so-called trustless transactions. And we're commonly familiar with this in the context of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ether and Litecoin and all these other kinds of things. But there's actually a lot more stuff that's interesting. What is a cryptocurrency? You probably already know this. A cryptocurrency is something that goes up in a huge speculative bubble. It makes a lot of people very wealthy, and then the economy of the world collapses when the bubble pierces. That's what a cryptocurrency is. But seriously, it's basically a way to secure transactions, to be able to control the creation of additional units and verify transfer of assets in theory. Sadly, at the moment, it seems that cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are more for speculation than for actually using it as a currency. In fact, a lot of places are not using it anymore because the price fluctuates so much, it's really hard to keep track of. So what's a blockchain? Well, basically, it's a continually growing list of blocks or records of transactions that are linked together and secured using cryptography. And this chain of blocks basically provides an open and distributed ledger that immutably records transactions between two parties effectively and securely or verifiably. Now, we'll come back and look at this a little later because immutable is a little confusing at first glance, and it doesn't quite mean what you think it means, but it's good enough for our right now. The blocks themselves that are connected together into this blockchain contain both data and metadata. The data is the transaction data, whatever's occurring that you want to keep track of, so transferring assets, for example, taking units from one account and moving them to another account. And then there's also a bunch of metadata, things like timestamps, as well as essentially a hashed pointer. It's a fingerprint that points to a previous block in the chain. And that's what makes it a blockchain. Things are chained together by these pointers. And it's done in a clever way, as we'll see, to make it very hard to tamper with the chain unless you have amazing control over all the resources that are part of the computation. The blocks in the chain are replicated across computers, in some cases many, many, many computers, rather than being stored in one server. And that, of course, leads to the next issue, which is decentralized platform, right? So the key issue here is you have a chain of blocks that are decentralized. So the platform itself, all the computing nodes, may be running globally and available in a public way where pretty much anyone, in theory, can read and write to these nodes. And that's typically what we come to understand through Bitcoin's blockchain, although there's many other variants. As a general rule of thumb, public blockchains are inherently and intentionally not that efficient in terms of getting things to work quickly, and we'll talk a lot about that later because that figures prominently into the whole issue of using for IoT and time-critical systems. But they're very useful when you can't trust all the participants to behave. So you essentially get safety in numbers, and we'll talk a bit more about that as well. You can also have more limited blockchains, sometimes called private blockchains, or maybe permission blockchains or consortium blockchains. And in this case, you typically have a much smaller number of parties involved. As we'll see for the IoT systems that we're typically interested in, these are much more likely to be the ones we're going to be using. And that has some good benefits because you can do different ways of demonstrating integrity and proving that you're actually a good citizen that are much more efficient than the public blockchain approaches. But they also tend to rely on the fact that the participants are more or less behaving. So if you can crack in and change that, then they may become vulnerable again as well. In either case, whether it be public or private, the nodes in the blockchain have a fairly high degree of independence. They can run in a peer-to-peer manner and communicate. So it's kind of like William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. Freedom, right? We have freedom to do things that aren't necessarily controlled in a centralized way. Now we start getting into the middleware part, right? So clearly this is not done purely by writing code that runs in the OS kernel. So there's actually layers, as always, in these systems. And the nodes that run in the peer-to-peer network in the blockchain environment have obviously the hardware and the computer networks that we all know and love. But there's also got several layers of middleware. Some of that middleware is kind of peer-to-peer communication middleware, the kinds of things you know if you've worked in peer-to-peer middleware systems for a long time, pub-sub kind of systems. And then there's also the blockchain middleware portions. And the blockchain middleware provides various services to applications that go way beyond what's there just out of the box, as middleware always does, right? So we have various things here like consensus managers to keep track of the consensus of all the different peer-to-peer nodes. There's, of course, the distributed ledger that's used to keep track of the ever-growing rows in this distributed database. There's the way you store this information. There's all kinds of different variants there that are interesting and relevant for some types of systems versus others. There's, of course, the peer-to-peer protocol for doing all this kind of thing. And that's, of course, the middleware part of all this stuff. So there's lots of good middleware stuff. Now, some blockchain implementations come sort of as a big bundle. You get what you get. Ethereum sort of falls into that category. So it's sort of usable off the shelf. It's kind of like platform as a service. Other middleware blockchain infrastructure comes more as infrastructure as a service, such as Hyperledger, where you get these modular building blocks and you can come and plug and play and modify things to work in different ways. That's, of course, a lot more interesting for people doing research for the IoT space. The last piece of the definition are trustless transactions. And what that really means is that this middleware enables relatively anonymous entities to exchange digital assets without the need for a centralized authority to verify the trust and to transfer the value. Now, for those of you who've ever seen the classic movie, The Princess Bride, you know Inigo Montoya, who often makes funny statements about certain words as not necessarily meaning what you think they mean. If you've never seen Princess Bride, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But the point here is that the word trustless doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means, right? So trustless, if someone comes up to me and says, this person's trustless, I would think, I can't trust that person. He's a bad person or she's a bad person. And what it really means here is you don't trust, but you build a system of consensus protocols that can make the system work in a sensible, immutable way without requiring centralized trust. The other thing to note here in this architecture is we can do these trustless transactions for recording and transferring of assets over top of the traditional internet. So this runs over all the good things we know and love, TCP/IP, and all the layers of protocols and middleware and infrastructure that we've known for a long time. So that's good. We don't have to go out and build a whole new system. There's several key characteristics of blockchains that I'll outline, and then Abhishek will go into more detail. So one of them is basically this blockchain protocol. And the blockchain protocol ensures a common, unambiguous ordering of blocks, and it guarantees the eventual integrity and consistency of the blockchain across the distributed nodes, which could be very widely geographically distributed. So that's one of the big issues. How do you make that work in a sensible way, especially when you start trying to do an IoT system? There's also this notion of an immutable replicated database. And in this context, this means that you have immutable information that's time-stamped in these blocks, which contain a bunch of transactions, and they're replicated on servers, which might be replicated and stored around the world. And it's kind of like the classic roach motel, if you ever know what a roach motel is, right? The roaches jog in, but they don't jog out, right? So data jogs into the distributed ledger, and once it's there, it can't change. And it turns out, for a variety of reasons having to do with the consensus protocol largely, that it's very, very hard to change a blockchain without some serious collusion. And even if you manage to change it, it's relatively easy for an auditor to figure out what's changed. And this has to do with the way that hashing and cryptography is used in order to link the various blocks together in the chain. And then there's also this concept of trying to have trust in the blockchain in terms of identity, knowing you don't necessarily know who the person is, you know what their avatar is, you know something about their virtual digital identity, and you can track that over time, and you can sort of get a sense of reputation. Are people doing sensible things? Are they doing nefarious things, and so on? So that could be tracked. People often think that blockchain is totally anonymous, and you can use it for things like smuggling guns or drugs or something like that. Nobody knows where you exist. And you can sort of do that, but people can track you down in surprising ways. Ironically, the origins of the blockchain protocol itself are shrouded in mystery. So there's this nefarious person, maybe he's not so nefarious, or he or she, Satoshi Nakamoto, who is the supposed inventor of the blockchain. It may be more than one person. And the NSA, the National Security Agency, has claimed to have figured out who this person is by doing content analysis of his or her writings, and then going and looking on the web and all the open source material available to them to figure out who else writes that way. That's basically the same way that they caught the Unabomber, FYI, Ted Kaczynski. They analyzed his manifesto and then found things that other people recognized, like his brother. So whether we'll actually know who this person is or not, it's just an interesting bit of trivia to this. So why does blockchain matter to us? Well, blockchain basically addresses the needs of various domains, especially the ones in the IoT space we're going to talk about, by providing decentralized transactions as a service. And this is basically done by disintermediating the central brokers, yet still allowing multiple parties who don't trust each other, or don't necessarily trust each other, to share a single database, to be able to read and write in a sensible way. So when problems fit that type of a mold, then blockchain is going to be a good candidate to consider. So what are some examples of this? Well, payments in the financial sector, right? So, MasterCard or stock trading or bonds. That was really the initial goal, was to disintermediate the banking system. And it's turned out, even though that a lot of people get all excited about this in the popular press, this probably isn't actually going to be something that's going to happen anytime soon. And the main reason for this is that that's the trade-off between disintermediation versus confidentiality. So the way that the blockchain protocols work today, the public ones like Bitcoin blockchain, you can trace the metadata. And there's an awful lot of people who don't really want to be traced at that level for a variety of reasons, both good and bad. So it turns out that people have kind of stepped back from trying to replace the banking system with blockchain, and they're actually looking at some other use cases. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these, and then I'll turn it over to Abhishek to go into some more detail about some of the technical stuff. One approach where it seems very useful, where blockchain is being applied, is for so-called lightweight financial systems. We're not trying to replace the banking system that we know and love. We're trying to replace bits and pieces of things that basically work by tokenizing payments and balances. So one example, something that we've worked on at Vanderbilt, is, and has also been done by a number of folks in Europe, is streamlining interactions between commuters in a multimodal transit system. So you might want to have a situation, as we're trying to do in Nashville, which I think is being widely used in Europe, where people can go from point A to point B, from where they live to where they work or wherever, using multiple modes of transportation in a seamless way with their smartphone, keeping track of where they are, and then using cryptocurrencies to keep track of their balances, thereby eliminating the overhead of credit card transactions and so on, but still being able to have a way of doing automatic reconciliation. So we've built a cool app called the Transit Hub app to do some of these kinds of things at Vanderbilt. Another example that you'll hear more about in just a moment is improving the efficiency of energy transactions in smart microgrids, where you want to be able to have prosumers, producers and consumers of sustainable energy like wind farms or solar power, be able to do these microtransactions to buy and sell energy in real time without having to go back to the power grid or some centralized broker to manage all that overhead and collect a fee. Yet another motivation, which I think is a really interesting one, is actually being rolled out now in Jordan, where there's a Syrian refugee camp that's managed by the United Nations, where they use Ethereum in order to be able to provide aid to refugees in a manner that doesn't require any centralized infrastructure. It doesn't require, there is no infrastructure in the classic way that we know it. There's no bunch of ATM machines on street corners and things like that. Very, very primitive conditions. And they want to be able to make sure that people can get food, clothing, and other aid in a cost-effective and secure manner. And they also want to make sure that they didn't have to be beholden. It's the UN after all. They didn't want to be beholden to a particular government or a particular institution like the Royal Bank of Scotland or Bank of America. And of course, they also want to try as much as they could to make sure that the aid was spent on things that they wanted to be spent on, like food and clothing, and not on drugs or alcohol or guns or whatever, right? So this turns out to be a really good use case for the blockchain. Another style of application domain where this works well is inter-organizational record keeping, which is something that's becoming increasingly interesting, at least in the US, in terms of personalized healthcare, where you want to be able to give providers and patients or their surrogates better access and control over their health information records. So imagine you're in a situation where you would like to give control to someone to do medical stuff and access your medical records, but you've been knocked unconscious due to a traffic accident. How do you give permission to do that? Well, one way to do it is to use a consensus model where you could have a number of trusted surrogates, and if 3 out of 5 of them give the ER surgeon access, then they can access your medical records. Just as an example. In all these situations, for all these different cases, blockchain gives you an alternative way of doing things to using centralized brokers, which could yield significant savings in both hassle and cost. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Abhishek, and he's going to talk about some of the technical foundations of blockchain and focus more on the interesting use cases in the IoT.
A lot of you might already be actually familiar with the technical foundations. So I'll sort of be at least a little bit on a high level. If you have any questions, we can actually discuss later on. So one of the interesting things is actually blockchain is not just a middleware problem, actually. If you remember that the key problem here is actually you want to actually order the transactions, you want to cryptographically protect them, you want to cryptographically link them. This actually leads to really intersection of 3 computer science branches. There's actually a lot of work in game theory in this. So the whole concept of proof of work that you guys might have heard about actually brings incentives, and it's based on the game theoretical principles. There is this whole notion of actually efficient use of cryptography. And of course, at the bottom line, it is actually distributed systems problem, right? So what is the key problem in here? So if you actually really drill down, what we really are trying to do is actually keep a consistent snapshot of data across a large distributed systems. So now this is not a new problem. If we wanted to actually track data across all the internet, right? We can go with the centralized database system, and this will be a classic system a lot of companies run. There is a big central enterprise server running it, and all the clients actually connect to that server. This particular central server could actually be replicated in the backend. So there are a number of slaves, and when the primary fails, it rolls over to the slave, and a proxy at the front makes sure that the clients are not affected. So this is the classical approach, right? Now, what is basically the problem in this? This is exactly the same kind of centralized problem. There is a single place, which is actually the ground truth, and that single place can actually possibly even be attacked. Now, there is actually a different system that has been really started by actually the large internet companies. So when Google started actually creating a data center all over the world, right? They figured out that they also actually wanted to make sure that the search queries go to the nearest data center, and the results actually came back out of that data center. So it doesn't always go to Mountain View, right? Otherwise, it really won't be efficient. So now they decided this whole sort of semi-distributed, right? So it's not decentralized, it is distributed. Databases are running all over their data centers, but they are linked with each other, right? So still, clients go to this data center to actually ask the answer, okay, what is the answer to my query? So this is slightly different than the traditional centralized approach. Now, of course, a lot of you who were familiar with Napster and BitTorrent are actually completely familiar with this concept, that what we can do is, instead of actually storing everything in these data centers, what if we just store it on our servers, right? Movies on our servers, and start sharing it. At that time, it was illegal, and it is still illegal. But what if it is not the movies that you are sharing, but rather it's the transactions that you are sharing, right? And I think this is really the intersection of that old 2000 and 2001, the big decentralized database boom, and actually where blockchain comes from. Now, of course, what is the key advantage here? To really actually compromise this network, and we are not talking about consensus, we are not talking about ordering, even to actually get rid of the information and try to do something like a distributed denial of service attack, you really have to get a majority of these seeders or sharers out of the system, which really becomes increasingly difficult, right? And that's one of the key value of the decentralized database concept. Now, there is actually another reason this decentralized database system is actually valuable. So for example, let's go back to the example that Doug talked about, the refugee camp. What is the biggest problem in refugee camps? You really have lack of infrastructure. So we really could not have actually put together a centralized Oracle database or a SQL Server's database and actually gave everybody an access token that they log in and they start getting access to it. That just becomes very difficult. So what do you really want? You really want something like Napster. Everybody's phone starts talking to everybody's phone, and just suddenly information is exchanged, right? So that's the reason such a protocol, a decentralized protocol, is actually very, very efficient for those kind of scenarios, right? But effectively, it is not just so simple as actually sharing the data, because unlike transferring of movie assets, if we are actually transferring cryptocurrency or actually transferring medical records, there is some notion of integrity that must be maintained, right? In the case of movies, fine, somebody actually hacked or changed the movie, it's okay, you will actually see something slightly different. It's not such a big deal, right? So when we actually take a look into these kind of decentralized databases, we have to ask ourselves the question, okay, how do we actually achieve consensus? So this is where we actually take a little bit of detour and go towards the past, right? Quite interestingly, blockchain, specifically the consensus part of the blockchain, is not a new problem. This problem has been studied, and a lot of you probably know this already from 80s, right? But before we can actually explain that, we have to actually talk about a fundamental difference between two different kind of networks that actually exist in this decentralized networking. One is something which is called asynchronous network. Asynchronous networks typically means that when I send a query, actually I really don't know when the response is going to come. And it could actually get delayed, it could get lost, doesn't matter. On the other side is synchronous networks. Synchronous networks are like phones. When I'm actually sending a request, I know the reply will come in certain time, or I would actually know that the reply is actually lost. So these are the two different kind of networks. And why is it very important is because in one case, you can actually achieve consensus. In the other case, you cannot, okay? Because you don't know when the messages are lost. Now, either of the case, really what is the mutual interest for us? We want to actually make sure that all the data that is actually being distributed across this database of ours can actually be updated at any site, and everybody else actually agrees to that update. And now this is going slightly more than what Napster or BitTorrent did. Because what they were doing was actually everybody was sharing almost a static copy of the database, and you just want to get all the blocks quickly, assemble them, and play your movie. You're not editing the movie. You're not creating a new version of the movie. But in the blockchain world, you might actually create an update to the database, right? So imagine you actually have the old data, you did a transaction, and your current account value changed. So everybody needs to actually agree to that account value. That's why this is slightly more difficult problem than just seeding or sharing the data in an abstract case or in the BitTorrent case. Now, to make matters worse, actually, because we are talking about physical realism, physical reality, we actually not only want to actually keep track of when the database value changes, we want to actually keep track of sequence or the order in which the data value changes, right? Take an example of your account. If your accounts actually changes just in the wrong order because your checks hit in the wrong order and your salary didn't arrive, your banks are very happy because they charge you overcharge, right? And banks actually, they don't say this, but I'm pretty sure that I have personally witnessed it. They have an algorithm where they actually put just the right number of transactions in the right amount to maximize your fees, right? And of course, you can go fight with them later, and I've done that, right? But that's the key. Everybody wants to agree to that sequence of transactions, because if that is not the case, you effectively are not going to agree on the outcome, right? So this particular value or this particular problem actually requires you to achieve consensus on each and every change that happened. Because if you can achieve consensus on each and every change that happened and the order in which they happened, right? Then you can actually achieve the consensus on the final outcome. Now, in 80s, this problem was actually studied at least on the sequence of actions, and this problem was actually called Byzantine general problem. And a lot of you most probably already actually know about this, but the key idea of the Byzantine general problem is that you want to make sure that a single traitor, or actually a group of traitors, cannot get half of the population of the generals to take a different action and the other half to take a different action. Everybody must actually agree on the same action, right? So if everybody wants to say attack, you want to attack. If everybody says you do not want to attack, you do not want to attack, right? And in a simple case, you can actually imagine what can go wrong in this, because if your consensus was built on just a simple voting concept, and there's one person who actually says to a group of people that we actually said attack, now they believe that it is the attack because that is a majority voting, and says to the other group, not attack. The other group would actually vote upon not attacking. So only half of the people will actually end up attacking, and they will probably get massacred, right? So when you actually bring it down to the real world like IoT, this can actually be a sequence of transactions which is about money, right? So half of the people think something happened, and the other half of the people do not think something happened. Now this problem was actually studied in 1980s by Lamport, right? And if you actually think about it, for example, a single case like, not just transactions, like how it actually applies, You can also think about in supply chain, right? So in the classical case in supply chain, if your sellers are actually distributed all over the world, right? And they are actually sending you different items at different times, and suddenly the producers raises their hand, hey, you actually never even sent me the item at the right time, so I'm not going to pay you, right? So how can they actually make sure that all of the data is actually maintained in a single record, right? Now, why it is a blockchain problem? Because it is quite possible you are actually in such remote locations, you might, even when the transactions are happening, you might not have the proper infrastructure, right? So you can't just send everything to a single central database, right? So that's where it's a supply chain, which is quite interesting. Now, these particular problems of Byzantine generals or consensus are actually well known to have been solved in synchronous cases, and this was basically Lampard's problem, right? Now, I also mentioned the totally asynchronous case, actually. The totally asynchronous case is actually very interesting because there is no results for it. This was actually proven in 1985 after Lampard's paper came out and said, sorry, if you actually cannot return the answers and you will never know when your message is failed, even one single traitor is done. Your system is done. And actually, this result still holds. People actually mistakenly think that blockchain have somehow solved this problem. No, it has not. You cannot solve this problem, and there are theoretical reasons why you cannot solve this problem, okay? So blockchain has not solved this problem. Now, what the problem the blockchain has actually solved for is actually something which is called partially asynchronous or partially synchronous case. Now, remember, blockchain was not the first one to solve this problem. This problem was actually solved by Liskov, and she actually had won a Turing Award, and of course, Lampard also won a Turing Award. The key case was that she worked with her co-author, and they showed that you can actually provide a same kind of consensus mechanism in systems where some of the messages could be delayed for a long time, right? And the main thing was actually, while the classical case actually talks about 3 times the number of people who can be traitor, in this case, through a number of sequence of protocols, which I'm not going to go into detail here, there is a paper, and if you are interested and you don't know, we can actually discuss later. She figured out that actually you only need to wait for 2n+1 responses before you actually take the next step in the transaction. So that actually just made the system a little bit more efficient and made it possible. Now, there is something different beyond this that was actually done in the blockchain case. So in the 2008, when the paper actually came out, one of the things that actually they started bringing in and integrated together was this whole notion of incentives. So why is this Bitcoin boom really happened after 2008, right? Everybody figured out there is something called mining, and if we actually mine the Bitcoins, we actually get a percentage of the Bitcoins. And at that time, the Bitcoin's value was high. Mining is really easy. Do it in university. The dean pays the electricity, right? And you make the money, right? Don't do it in your university, right? My dean does not know we do this. Don't tell him that, right? But the key notion is there is actually an incentive for players to get money and to actually validate transactions. So they have an incentive not to be malicious, right? And it will actually become clear in the proof of work algorithm, I will say next time, that why is that the case. But because the players have this incentive, they can all validate transactions quickly at their own place and then immediately announce the answer. So effectively what it does, it actually reduces the number of messages that are being exchanged compared to the practical Byzantine fault tolerance. Now, the problem is this is actually a stochastic algorithm. So what that means is there is no guarantee that it will actually give you consensus. There is a very high likelihood because of the incentivization that you will actually reach eventual consensus. And in most cases, people do reach eventual consensus in this case. And that's approximately around 6 blocks. You have to actually wait for after you have actually mined your transaction and things settle down. So this is just an average number based on that. So exactly what is this incentive, right? And this is effectively this whole notion of called proof of work. And the idea typically is that you, as a participant, as a miner, will validate the sequence of transactions. And when you have actually validated the sequence of transactions, you have validated that the actual final amount or any amount at any point of the time the transaction happened is exactly correct. And once you have actually validated that, you effectively seal it in with a cryptographic puzzle. And in this case, the cryptographic puzzle, specifically in proof of work, is to find just the right number of nonsense to add to the block to actually create a right number of leading zeros, right? Now, this is actually a very interesting cryptographic problem because there is no algorithmic way of doing it, and you have to actually walk through all the possibilities to get the particular answer. Now, mind you, the day actually quantum computing becomes possible and somebody actually just breaks this apart, at that point this won't work, but today it actually works nicely. And because people have actually spent that much electrical energy in actually validating their transactions, they want to make sure that they actually get the reward that they were promised. Now, how do you actually get this reward? The reward effectively is locked into the same block that you mined. So you actually take some reward, the transaction when you created the block, it goes into your block. Now, at that point, because you mined the block, you have the reward. But what actually happens is this block will actually be transmitted all over the world, right? So other people will also actually check the block. And if you actually lied, there is quite likely there is a higher set of computational resources that are going to actually create chains that are different than your chain, right? So what is a chain? A chain is nothing but a sequence of blocks. Somebody could have actually created another block, right? And it is highly likely that people who are not malicious are larger in numbers. Because if there are at least 51% malicious people, then basically we are toast at that point, right? So in this particular case, if there are people that are less in numbers, that are malicious, then there is a higher percentage of population that have a higher chance of creating a set of blocks and sequencing those set of blocks and propagating them to a longer chain before the malicious blocks lead to malicious chains, right? Now, remember, this is all stochastic, all likely, right? But it typically works out. And basically what happens is, at some point in time, some miners are actually going to receive two chains because they are going to come from two sources, two set of blocks. And then there is actually a simple rule. The larger block wins, the larger chain wins. And you drop the old block. So now, what will happen to a person who was actually malicious and maliciously mined the block and let's say did double transaction, did not validate the transactions properly? At some point in time, people are going to start getting rid of their blocks in which they mined their incentive. Now, as soon as that is out, that's gone from the record, right? So it is likely that a lot of people will actually end up agreeing that that block was never mined, you were never given the incentive. So now all the electricity that you paid into mining your block is gone, right? So that is why it is not in your interest to be malicious, unless you actually own the majority of computing resources. Now, in this particular case, the majority of computing resources is 51%. So once that happens, you are actually going to actually get lost in, the whole thing will actually fail, right? Now, how does this happen typically? For example, when we are talking about a buyer and seller, right? So a buyer can actually try to double spend, right? So it is quite possible that the miner is not the one who is doing malicious thing. It is just the person who is initiating the transaction is trying to do the malicious thing. And if that does happen, there will be, again, a series of blocks that will be created. And the idea is finally, people will actually figure out that there are actually two transactions that are colliding with each other. And at that particular time, again, there will be some block, some chain that will win. So typically, when you are actually paying off people with block or bitcoins, you probably have to wait for a particular amount of time before things settle. And the consensus these days is wait for around 6 blocks before it reaches consensus. Now again, this is all stochastic, right? And this actually leads us to the next problem, that these are great ways of actually maintaining consensus. These are great ways to actually create and use in systems, for example, for finances. And again, algorithmically speaking, most of the times it actually works, right? But when we actually start applying in the Internet of Things, for example, we can actually apply it in, as Doug mentioned, as in the transportation case, right? So everybody is actually going from one place to another, and they are actually exchanging just either the information about what is the current traffic congestion, or they are actually exchanging financial incentives, right? So financial transfers. So in that case, a blockchain could be used. But remember, in the case of a transportation problem, you cannot wait for a really long time before things settle down, right? So each block typically takes around, let's say, 10 minutes to mine, right? And you're waiting for 6 blocks. You're waiting for 60 minutes before you should take your Uber, or your Uber driver should let you in. That really becomes a problem, right? So think about that, right? The same thing would actually happen in the case of energy transactions. So in the case of energy transactions, if you have a consumer who actually needs energy because you want to run a big machine in your home, and I don't know what you are doing, why you need a big machine, but let's say we know, right? So now instead of buying the energy from the central authority, you might actually buy energy from your neighbor who has excess solar power and has no battery, so their energy is getting wasted anyway, right? So they sell you at a cheaper rate than the utility company. So you exchange and the energy is transferred and you are balanced, right? So now, but depending upon when you need the energy, so if you need it in next 5 minutes, you have a problem, right? And not always can you actually trade in the future. So that's why, again, the timing actually becomes important in these systems. But going back to the concept of private chains, private networks, it becomes very applicable that you can apply those systems here, right? So going back to actually think about why, on the other hand, why are people actually talking about blockchains and Internet of Things? One of the reasons, as actually Doug mentioned earlier in his talk, is that the Internet of Things are effectively getting decentralized, right? So the transportation, the energy, the healthcare, everything is actually really now a collection of agents, collection of people. Now, of course, there is actually a completely separate aspect of maintaining decentralized control. So when I am actually saying that we transfer energy between producers and consumers, it's not just simple transfer of energy. There is somebody who's actually maintaining the control of the grid in the local community. Otherwise, if the active power and reactive powers don't balance out, you will have an issue, right? Blockchain does not solve that problem. Blockchain just allows you to actually exchange the transaction. But there is something else behind the scene. And typically, this will be built on a classical middleware approach. You will actually bring classical control algorithms. So that's actually that part, right? Now, of course, this whole notion of decentralized information that we have been discussing actually comes into the play in these kind of decentralized systems. So just to give you a quick example of actually giving a little bit going more in the transactive energy systems, because that's actually an example that we have worked with, I'll just show you actually what this whole production and consumption means. So typically in a community, actually there could be multiple homes that are so-called smart homes, right? So what does smart home means? You actually have a number of heaters, you have number of washing machines, ovens, which you can program ahead of time. So what that means is you can actually decide when to turn something on, and what that does is it allows you to control your consumption profile. So if you actually think about the load that your house is going to inject on the community, you can control that, right? Now, production, which is typically, let's just imagine all the homes have actually nothing but a bunch of photovoltaics. So these are solar panels, right? The interesting thing about solar panels is that the energy is actually always like a bell curve. So at some point in time during the early mornings, there is really no energy. Towards around 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock, there is actually the energy production really peaks up, okay? And then after that, it just dials down. Now imagine you actually have lots and lots of homes like this, right? And when you add them together, they actually have a lot more energy available in a local community that they can do anything with it, right? So suppose you can imagine some of the homes might have batteries, but battery technology is actually very expensive right now, right? So you cannot actually store all of the power that you have generated. So that's where actually this whole notion of transfer of energy actually becomes very interesting, because you might take your excess energy that you cannot store in your battery, you cannot consume locally, and you can start showing it off to the consumers in your community. Now, why is it interesting for the utility company, right, or an electrical company? Because if you actually do just the right summation of production and do the negation of consumption, you might just get a very stable profile for this whole community that the utility company likes to see. They do not like to see a lot of variation, which typically happens when you have renewables. Because now they can plan for when they need to start their big generators. They need to start their big coal generators or big gas generators, right? So that is really the thing that helps them. And how you can actually arrange this system, you can actually create a local market. And that's where blockchain, the transactions become important. Now, if you actually think about this local market, there will be a lot of time synchronized data exchange. There is, again, as I've actually mentioned before, there is going to be a lot of time critical information. There's going to be a lot of time critical actions, right? Now, we actually use blockchains in this, but this is clearly not necessarily applicable for private blockchains. Or not private, sorry, public blockchains, right? This is more applicable for actually private blockchains. And clearly the reason is more because of timing, okay? Now, there is actually a problem of information privacy here that people typically, when they are thinking about blockchains, they just never think about this. The problem is, if you think about blockchain, it's nothing but a database, right? This database should be readable by everybody in the community who logs in, right? Because that is effectively your data store. They could be doing the mining, they could be doing the validating. So now this data store is not encrypted at all. So what is encrypted in blockchain? Your anonymous ID, right? Your single account ID. But what you actually forget is that typically at some point in time, you are actually going to sync with the system. The point that I was making is that the whole notion of information privacy is what people don't think about, because actually the account IDs that you are using can easily be traced back to the people, because at some point in time, you're going to try to either exchange, and there is actually some activity that will happen when you are actually using your account ID, so you can actually correlate. Now, we have been actually working on this particular problem, and there is actually a series of papers that are available on our website, and this is one of the papers that actually talk about this whole notion of how you are actually building these kind of transactive IoT systems. Now, one thing which is actually really behind the scenes here is that we have started realizing that there is actually a pattern that you have to program, that you have to develop in these particular systems. So one of the patterns is, till now, we have actually really talked about the IoT device to IoT device talking to each other. Now you really have to actually think about IoT device to IoT device communication, IoT device to storage communication, and actually IoT device to some sort of a decentralized code. Now, for example, Ethereum is actually, which is part of our blockchain protocol, does the smart contract. So you can actually integrate with that. So that kind of the protocol that actually exists and starts building up. And Mike, actually, when he talks about his paper, is going to talk a little bit more in detail about this protocol. And we are going to show like how to actually test this, right? So next, effectively, some of the things now to summarize, we have actually discussed this before, that time is actually a critical challenge, right? So one of the things why we use private blockchains specifically is because the Uber cars can actually really be far away if they actually start waiting for the whole 6 blocks to mine. So one of the specific things is proof of work as an algorithm for actually achieving consensus is not suited for these kind of applications. That's point number one. Point number two, public blockchain might actually not be suited at all, okay? So you might actually want to use some kind of private blockchain with something, for example, like proof of stake or proof of authority. Now remember, an assumption in a private blockchain is that you are actually talking in a system where you know the participants. So quite likely you can actually trust them more, that there will be less malicious people in there. So that's really the notion of private blockchain versus public blockchain. So just to wrap up, we actually talked about the privacy aspects of the blockchain, right? So this was actually just a picture from that Petra paper, that how do you actually achieve that? So one of the things that we actually do is when the buyers and sellers are actually transacting with the system, they actually keep changing their anonymous IDs. So they don't work with a single account ID. That's number one. And the number two is we actually use something called mixing services. So think about a massive big mixie. You put all of the transactions in one go and swirl them around. And each transaction is broken into various sub-transactions. So what gets recorded in the blockchain are not really the real transactions, but actually partial derivatives of those real transactions. So now it's slightly less likely that you will be able to trace back who is the actual starting person of the transaction or who is the person the transaction went to, right? So that's one of the ways that you can actually try to maintain privacy in this kind of blockchain world. Doug?
Great. So we'll wrap up real quick here. So it's probably safe to say that technology really hasn't arrived until it is lampooned in Dilbert. And here we have Dilbert's pointy head boss coming in and saying, I think we should build a blockchain. And Dilbert wants to know whether he really understands what he's talking about, whether it's just a buzzword of the day. So we asked him, what color do you want that blockchain? And he says, I think mauve has the most RAM. So one of the things that's happening these days is that blockchain is very heavily hyped. If you look at the Gartner hype cycle from a year or two ago, it was getting close to the top of initial expectations, the peak of initial expectations, and it's probably about to slide down into the trough of disillusionment. And what we're hoping to do is, through the research we're doing and the research done by the middleware and IoT community, figure out a way to make it actually be productive for people who pick the right pieces, pick the right protocols, pick the right middleware services, and apply them in the right way. And so that's really kind of the theme. We've been doing some work for the last year and a half or so at Vanderbilt on this topic, together with our sponsors and industry partners. And so if you're interested in being involved, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to partner on these things. We find that, especially in the transactive energy domain, there's a lot of interest from Europe. We've been working closely with our colleagues in Siemens, in Germany, and other parts. And it's really exciting because they have great infrastructure in place from a prosumer point of view. And now we're seeing to the extent to which we can leverage these newer technologies to work effectively in that context. Okay, so thank you guys very much. Okay. Yes. This is an Ethernet protocol problem, by the way. Put polite people in a dark room. Yeah, great question. So the question basically was, if you look at the news, I think this was actually in money.cnn.com from 3 or 4 days ago. They talked about the fact that the amount of energy required to do one Bitcoin transaction was enough to heat a house or cool a house for a couple days, or just some crazy thing. And the accumulated amount of energy is staggering and actually somewhat embarrassing from a sustainability point of view. That is largely for the reasons that Abhishek was talking about, trying to do the proof of work, trying to give this trustless transaction in a world of potentially bad actors where you have to get the information to flow around. It takes about 10 minutes and lots of nodes redundantly do the computations. That's something that could easily be solved. Well, it could be solved. How easily it could be solved is another story for research. But it could be solved in a context where you're doing a permissioned network or a private blockchain where you have proof of stake or proof of authority, where you're going to anoint certain nodes as having greater privileges or greater something or other to trust what they're doing. You could make that cost go much, much lower. That, of course, seems like a solution, but it opens up another can of worms, right? What happens if some bad actor, because even though you're not totally centralized, you're getting a little bit more centralized. So what if bad actors come in and then take over, 51% or less, because now you've got authority nodes that are making decisions. You're kind of trading one set of problems for another. So the good news is the ability to go back and audit stuff is still there. So as long as you're able to go back and look at the books and say, oh, so-and-so has been stealing energy from the local prosumer network, we're going to go and fine him or her. As long as you can audit it, you probably can make up for that. But the energy problem is mostly due for the way that the blockchain network works in the public blockchain. Do you want to add anything more to that?
Yeah, so what Doug said actually is precisely correct. One of the things that we have to actually think about, on the other hand, is why is the variation or the dollar amount of Bitcoin is actually rising so much? So effectively, you really start to think about it, it's funny because it is quite possible that even though people are not realizing it, the value prospect is actually catching up because that much money it takes to actually mine a Bitcoin. So at some point in time, if the value actually stabilizes and it reaches at that particular level, then quite possible that the transaction value and how much energy it requires to do a transaction will also come down, because that will become the economics problem at that time.
Many years ago, I was working in, I was just a grad student, this is 30-some years ago. We did a lot of work with Ada. And we used to joke that Ada was actually a plot by hardware manufacturers to sell more memory and CPU, right? Because it took forever to compile and it was really big and slow. And so sometimes I wonder whether blockchain and Bitcoin isn't a conspiracy by energy manufacturers to continue to have demand for their resources and keep the price of oil high or something like that. So that's why we need these sustainable energy models that can bring the price down.
One of the things that connects to is the domain of this, if you don't mind, stimulating might the launch. It doesn't, in some sense. And yeah, okay, Phil's in is good. If you look at something, there's this incentives because we're looking at a similar. Every is a different. The issue, no, unless you want an interest, you need a way to get electricity. And yeah, sure, like community, but fundamentally, the ownership interest is what, and it means that if you hold, I'm not doing, and then moving, but then I don't believe I'm stating it. But my point is that in that, when you look at that, you've got a problem that you're working in hypothetical Ethereum risks of software going awry and stealing stuff, you know, even though it's supposed to solve problems, it just, and yet you already need it. It's linking to make this system. So I don't know, do you feel about put where I will Syria versus the sorts of micro web.
By the way, I think you just gave a very compelling argument against net neutrality. Because somebody has to put that infrastructure in there and they need to be incentivized to keep it up to date. And if you make them put the pipes in and then everybody else makes all the money, they're not incentivized to keep it going for long. Do you want to take a shot?
Yeah, I can speak.
Well, here.
Oh,
We're
okay.
recording it.
Yeah, okay. No, that's actually a very, very valid point. And this is actually, even if you totally forget about blockchains, completely forget about blockchains, just the discussion about actually photovoltaics and the renewable integration of what to do, because now you're not buying from the utility company. Just that simple discussion actually brings this point. The utility company is asking, what is it for me? If you are actually going to completely produce your energy, why don't you go off the grid? Utility company at that point is actually totally providing you this sort of a flexibility that if something goes wrong, I'm going to be there to back you up with the excess capacity. So they have the extra risk, right? So going backward to your point, that's precisely absolutely correct. Now, given that there would actually be certain cases where there are actually large, quick microgrids that have to be created. So for example, a classic case would be Afghanistan, right? So for example, if the US battlefield is there and all of them actually have to be connected to a grid, there's really no central grid provider. Now you do have to keep a local exchange of information. Now in this case, you have no cloud server, you have no security. Perhaps maybe blockchain actually becomes a case for that, right? So you really have to actually find, even in the same application domain, there'll be some use cases that will actually be very applicable and some use cases that are not going to be very applicable.
Well, but I think that's your Sure. What I find ironic is it's being tested in like, you're like,
Right.
oh, come on.
Yeah.
Like everyone has probably 4G access on every, completely wrong. But that's what I mean by the no problem with technology. It works. People don't have a clear idea. Clearly, where do you totally New Zealand, we're just totally any place the grid, the benefits you get mean you want to rely non.
Yeah, but just the only thing to add to is that as academics, right, we want a system which we can access. So for us, selfish interest, it's good to be tested in Manhattan.
By the way, obviously you're not watching The Walking Dead because you don't know the zombie apocalypse is coming, and the people who have this technology are the only ones who are going to make it, right? So, but actually, to be fair, I think the real point, well, one of the key points you're making here is that for things like energy, regulatory concerns are often enormous limiting factors for the ability of any technology to roll out in any timely way. And that's what's so fascinating about, say, Europe versus the US, probably versus Australia or New Zealand. Everybody has slightly different models, and everybody's trying to incentivize things with more or less degrees of central control and market control and this, that, and the other thing. And so our job is to see what's possible, and then we'll let the regulators figure out what's feasible, if that makes sense. So I think if I understand your question, it comes to sort of on-chain, off-chain types of transactions. Is that essentially, you want to talk about that in the context of?
So that's again a good point, and this is not really well understood yet. Actually, do we want to keep all of the particular transactions, or we want to sort of hash things together? Now, in a slightly different domain where this kind of problem also comes in is that when we actually start talking about reliability of distributed systems, we might actually decide when does our transaction, and not the same transaction, but sort of the information transaction, when does it begin, when does it end? And what I would say is that I really don't have a very specific good answer for this, but it will totally depend upon the application domain and how quickly do you want the transaction to be agreed upon by everybody. So if you really want to do it very quickly, then in that case, you really want to put it on the chain. But if you can actually sustain for some time, then you can actually collect and aggregate a number of records off the chain and then start it on the chain.
It might also come down to, it really has to do with reconciliation time in some sense, I think. So you can imagine a world where you get billed once a month for your prosumer usage. In that case, you could probably do this kind of batching for efficiency purposes using these technologies in a blockchain-like world for IoT, because you can reconcile it. As long as it gets reconciled before the next bill shows up and you have auditability to show why it cost what it did and who sold what to whom and when, it's probably fine. If, on the other hand, you go back to the Uber case, if the driver wants to get paid the minute he or she drops you off, then it may be a bigger issue. But even there, they probably get paid in chunks, right? Every quarter or every week or something. Right. So I suspect you guys probably have the same thing in your banking system. If you deposit a check, it'll say, let's say you deposit a $10,000 check, it'll say, you can withdraw $300 now, right? We'll trust you with $300 of this, because you can't get very far on $300, but then after 2 days or whatever it takes to reconcile, then you get the rest of the money. So that's probably a realistic thing. And I guess it's probably like that for the same reasons. Even though we have a centralized system, reconciliation is not immediate. And so they have to wait a while to verify and know your customer kind of stuff.
Yes, and then they actually ding you here. So now you $300 plus the.
You can tell many of us were grad students living, hand to mouth for long periods of time. This is when that experience shows up.
No, so
Why don't you rephrase it?
So effectively, I think the question that you're asking is do all the use cases when we are actually talking about blockchain?
I guess so. Right. That would be the trading. We have
Right.
the only way.
No,
The ones way.
so let's actually think about a slightly different use case, right? So electrical medical records, right? Electronic medical records. So in that case, there is no trading that is actually happening. But what you want to keep track of actually when did somebody's medical record got accessed and who actually accessed it, right? So in that case, now this particular information could really again be kept in a single electronic medical center. And again, going to the point, if we are living in a city with a great infrastructure, with a great hospital, it totally makes sense that your hospital actually tracks it and you actually use a cloud-based approach. However, for example, in a refugee camp or in a war area, like somewhere where you actually have an ad hoc center, ad hoc infrastructure, you still might actually want to keep track of exactly that kind of record, who has access to the private medical information, who doesn't. Now, sometimes people actually confuse in this particular use case that the medical record data itself is stored in the blockchain. That's really not the case. You might store the medical record somewhere else in an encrypted form, and the key to the medical record is actually in the blockchain, and the access details of the medical record is in the blockchain. Now, in this particular case, there is really no transaction occurring. However, the sequence of activity is what is agreed upon and what is auditable. So would that be another use case?
And
So there's this article that is available here. By the way, we'll put all the slides out so you can see it. And the author identifies four main genuine use cases for blockchain, and I listed a couple here. He starts by saying payments in the financial services thing is probably just not going to work. You're not going to replace Visa yet. But he talks about lightweight financial systems. He talks about the inter-organizational record keeping. He talks about provenance tracking, which I think is a little bit about what you're talking about. And then there's also this, I think it was like multi-organizational agreement, where you basically have a bunch of organizations agree to use sort of a central clearinghouse to do these things on their behalf. And the trick is to find these cases where you want to be able to have multiple readers and writers of the shared database who don't really trust each other, where disintermediation is important, but unless we can solve the confidentiality problem that you talked about, you're not obsessed about having people see that things are occurring. Now, you can always find ways to shroud that, but somebody clever could probably find ways to break that. So that it's at least worth looking at in terms of some genuine use cases versus all the ones that people cook up that really don't make any sense at all. So speaking of which, peer-to-peer, has anybody here seen the TV show Silicon Valley? So it's a classic, very, very funny show. If you're in the IT industry, it's kind of like Dilbert, except it's for people who work in startup companies and stuff like that. And if you watch the show, you'll recognize the stereotypical characters because you've met those people. Anyway, where I was headed with this was, in the last season, I think season 4, Richard Hendricks, the protagonist, has been talking about a decentralized internet. And if you watch very carefully, that he's really putting out blockchain. He's really doing blockchain and sharding and peer-to-peer and sharing information in a BitTorrent-like way on everybody's computer, so there's no centralized anything. And when Abhishek and I met Gavin Woods, who's the guy who invented Ethereum, he said that they actually have talked to them about getting them in the show, and you can see the Ethereum stuff in a whiteboard on one of the episodes. So there's definitely some realization that what they're talking about in that show and what blockchain is trying to be is not an accident. It's pretty funny.
No, that's precisely a good point. The Hyperledger, which is actually different than Ethereum, right, actually provide this kind of modular consensus models. So you can actually choose. PBFT is actually one of the models that they support. So we have to actually sort of break down blockchain and what really this is about. Let's not worry about blockchain, Bitcoin, and these hyped up words. It's effectively just, as you said, a way to actually achieve consensus. And if PBFT works, great, right? The other thing is, how do you actually incentivize code execution? So you run some code that validates something that was already in the data and produces new data. And why would I run that, right? So that becomes the incentive model of the blockchain, the smart contract model. Now, Hyperledger supports Go as a language. They do the same thing. And so if you break it down, this is really sort of, as I said earlier, like bringing the game theoretic incentivization into the middleware community, right? Because we did remote procedure calls. We did actually, PBFT is not new. And there are various fault tolerance models, Byzantine fault tolerance models. You start putting them together, you might actually get Hyperledger. Or you might get Ethereum with different things. Or you might actually create something completely new. So effectively, there are few things that you need. You need to have ability to achieve consensus. You need to be able to actually run code on behalf of somebody. You need to be able to record the output of the code. When you have that, you got a service that you can call blockchain.
Well,
they now call it because they're already doing it.
Well, and I think it ties it back to the theme of the overall theme of the workshop and the Middleware Conference and so on, right? This not only is peer-to-peer cool again, but middleware is cool again because this is all about middleware, right? It's nothing but middleware if you think about it. It's not about the network, although there's a network. It's not about the operating system, those are an operating system. It's about all the services that layer on top of that. And it gives us another reason to be proud of our community and the things we've done for a long time. And as I started out earlier, it's a good example of trying to take something that was intended for another purpose and then figure out just exactly what you have to go in with an X-Acto knife and slice up and change and repackage in order to be able to make it work in these new environments. And that's kind of cool from a research point of view. Yes, sir.
Yes and no, right? So actually, if you think about it, so first of all, if it was time critical, I would really not do that, okay? Now, I'm assuming that we are not talking about time-critical cases. So I'm trying to get to a picture, hopefully. Yes. So in blockchains or in this kind of consensus concepts, the possibility of creating something called forks is actually very much there. So what that means is actually, let's say I send the data to Africa, there is network latency, right? So there are new blocks that have been mined actually around US before even the data packet that actually reached the miner in Africa. And the miner in Africa is actually going to mine the blocks, and great, right? They never even got the announcements of the blocks that were created. Eventually, that miner will actually get a data dump from somewhere. And at that particular point in time, they will realize that they actually have two different forks, because one of the things you have to remember is the block contains the header or the hash of the previous. So it's a way to form a linked list, right? So at some point in time, you will say this linked list does not match the old linked list, and where are the differences? And then you will pick the longest chain. Now, if the Africa, the latency was this high, then it is quite likely that you will have the smaller chain. So at that point, yes, you would lose out. As a miner, you will lose out all of the resources, the energy resources that you put into the case.
Well, and I think you're also, contemporary current events, there are certain parts of the world that are trying to do bad things at the moment. And I've heard as the Bitcoin price goes up, they're spending more and more time trying to hack things. And so if you have these differential latencies, then you don't really get the safety in numbers you think you do, because a lot of the parties are really not participating in any meaningful way. And so if someone can figure out how to exploit those things, they could really they could break the consensus model that the whole Bitcoin protocol at least is based on, which is actually probably something people are trying to do right now. Yeah. By the way, that's another job security thing, right? Either figuring out just like antivirus stuff. You either figure out ways to write viruses, and then you can find ways to find them, or you find ways to break the protocol, or you find ways to defend them. It's great for job security. Great. Well, thank you again very much.